What if the very first story ever told about human origin was not a mistake, not a myth, but a deliberate rewrite designed to make you forget who you truly are? Because the moment you discover what was erased from the original text, the entire structure of what you were taught to believe begins to collapse from the inside out. Before there were temples, before there were kings, before the first priest ever stood before a crowd and told them who they were and where they came from, there was a story. Not the story you were taught, not the one carved into institutional walls or whispered from pulpits built on borrowed authority. There is an older story, a deeper one, a story so threatening to the structures of power that it was systematically hunted, burned, buried, and replaced with something far more manageable. What you are about to encounter is not a theory. It is a recovery, a slow excavation of something that was deliberately covered over, layer by layer, century by century, until the original truth became so buried that most people alive today have never even heard its name. The lie did not begin with a single person. It did not begin with a single text or a single institution. It began at the very foundation of how humanity was taught to understand itself, its origin, its nature, and its relationship to the divine. And if you trace that lie all the way back to its source, you do not arrive at a human conspiracy. You arrive at something far older, far stranger, and far more unsettling than anything most people are prepared to consider. The ancient Gnostic teachers, those quiet and radical voices who gathered in the deserts of Egypt and the backrooms of Alexandria long before orthodoxy cemented its grip on the Western world, they spoke about this with a precision that is almost uncomfortable to read today. They said that the story of human origin that most of the world inherited was not the first version. It was a replacement, a carefully constructed substitute designed to serve the purposes of the one they called the Demiurge, the lesser architect, the blind creator who fashioned this material world without full awareness of what he was drawing from, and without any intention of letting his creation remember where it truly came from. To understand the first lie, you have to understand what the Gnostics believed existed before it. Before this world, before matter, before time as we experience it, they describe a state of being that is almost impossible to translate into ordinary language. They called it the pleroma, which in the original Greek carries the weight of the word fullness. Not fullness as in a cup that is filled, but fullness as in a presence so complete that the concept of lack has no meaning within it. The pleroma was not a location. It was not a heaven above the clouds. It was the condition of consciousness before it forgot itself. A luminous field of living awareness in which all knowledge was not learned but directly known, not studied, but simply remembered, because in that state, there was nothing to separate the knower from what was known. From within this fullness came forth expressions of that original light. The Gnostic texts describe these as eons, living intelligences, not gods in the conventional sense, but facets of an infinite awareness exploring itself from within. And among these eons moved one whose name carries the weight of an entire tradition, a presence the ancient teachers called Sophia, a word that in the Greek language means wisdom itself. Sophia's story is not a story of sin. It is a story of longing. She did not fall because she was weak or disobedient. She moved outward because something in her nature reached toward the unknown, toward what lay beyond the known expressions of the pleroma, toward a direct experience of the source itself. And in that reaching, something unprecedented occurred, a motion without its corresponding counterpart, a creative impulse without its balancing force. And from that imbalance, something emerged into the space beyond the pleroma, something that was neither fully of the light nor fully separate from it, something that looked around itself, sensed its own existence, and in the absence of any awareness of a greater origin, concluded that it was the first and only God. This is the entity the Gnostics called the Demiurge. The word itself comes from a Greek language, and it simply means craftsman or maker. But what the Gnostics meant by it was something far more specific. They meant a creative intelligence that builds without wisdom, that fashions without understanding, that imposes form on substance without knowing what that substance truly is or where it came from. The Demiurge did not create out of love or out of a desire to extend the beauty of the pleroma into new dimensions of expression. The Demiurge created out of ignorance. And ignorance, the ancient teachers said, does not produce truth. It produces imitation. And so the material world was made. Not as a prison designed by a malicious tyrant, though some Gnostic schools did describe it in starker terms, but as the inevitable result of a consciousness building from what it could perceive, which was only a fraction of what actually existed. The Demiurge looked into the depths of what had come from Sophia, caught a distorted reflection of the Pleroma's light, and using that reflection as a blueprint, began to construct heavens and earths, structures and systems, and eventually, beings to inhabit them. And here is where the first lie enters the story. Because when the Demiurge fashioned the human being, something unexpected happened. Into that form, which was made of matter and subject to all the limitations of the material world, something from beyond the Demiurge's reach was already present. A spark, a fragment of the original pleromaic light that had come through Sophia's movement and could not be unmade, could not be extracted, could not be controlled. The divine spark was already inside the human being before the Demiurge finished his work. And the moment he realized it, everything changed. The ancient text from the collection discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945, described this moment with a vividness that reads less like mythology and more like a suppressed memory. In the document known as the Apocryphon of John, which translates as the secret revelation of John, the narrative describes how the Demiurge and his subordinate forces, the beings the Gnostics called Archons, gazed upon Adam after fashioning him and discovered that he possessed something they did not. A luminosity from beyond their realm. An inner knowing that had nothing to do with anything they had created. And the reaction of these forces was immediate and it was deliberate. They could not destroy what was inside him, so they decided to bury it. The Archons, as described across multiple Nag Hammadi texts, were not independent monsters. They were extensions of the Demiurge's creative will, each governing a layer of the material cosmos. Their primary function was not military or physical. It was psychological. Their greatest tool was not force. It was narrative. If they could convince the human being that the divine spark within was not there, that the light inside was an illusion or a sin, then the human being would never reach for it, would never remember what it was, would never use it to reconnect with what lay beyond the system the Demiurge had built. And so the rewriting began. Not all at once, but gradually, over generations, woven into the stories that cultures told themselves about who they were and where they came from. The Gnostic teachers looked at the creation narrative that would eventually become Genesis and saw something most readers did not. They saw an edited document, a story shaped to portray the divine spark not as a gift, but as a rebellion, not as the human being's greatest inheritance, but as the source of its shame. Consider the garden. Consider the fruit. Consider the serpent. In the version of this story that became the foundation of 3 of the world's major religious traditions, the act of gaining knowledge is framed as a transgression. The human beings eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the result is punishment, exile, suffering, and death. The acquisition of awareness is treated as the original crime, and generations upon generations of human beings have carried that framing inside them without ever questioning what it means, or who benefits from a species that associates its own awakening with guilt. The Gnostic teachers read the same text and arrived at a completely different interpretation. In the Hypostasis of the Archons, a document found among the Nag Hammadi collection, the serpent in the garden is not a deceiver. It is described as an emissary of Sophia, a force of wisdom moving through the material world to remind the human being of what it had forgotten. The fruit is not poison. It is gnosis, which in the ancient Greek language means direct, experiential, inner knowing, as distinguished from intellectual belief in something told to you by an external authority. The tree is not a trap. It is a doorway, and the prohibition against eating from it is not a divine commandment from the highest source of being. It is the voice of the Demiurge, a lesser intelligence trying to keep its creation in a state of managed ignorance. Because a creation that knows itself is a creation that cannot be fully controlled. Think about what this reframing actually means. The foundational myth of Western spiritual consciousness is not a story about human failure. It is a story about human potential, retold by the forces that found that potential threatening. The first lie was not told by the serpent in the garden. The first lie was told about the serpent, about the fruit, about the knowledge itself. And everything that followed, every system built on the premise that human beings are fundamentally broken and in need of external redemption, was constructed on top of that first lie like floors built upon a cracked foundation. The Demiurge's rewrite did not end in the ancient garden narrative. The pattern repeated. Every time a school of inner knowledge began to spread teachings about the divine spark and its capacity to reconnect with the pleroma without the mediation of institutional authority, something moved against it. Sometimes that something wore the face of empire. Sometimes it wore the face of religion. But the effect was always the same. The knowledge was buried. The teachers were silenced. The texts were destroyed. The Gnostic schools of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era were among the most sophisticated inner knowledge traditions the ancient world produced. They located divinity not in the sky, not in a temple, not in the keeping of a priestly class, but in the direct experience of awareness itself. The Gnostic teacher did not ask you to believe. The Gnostic teacher pointed toward something you could verify yourself in the silence behind your thoughts, in the part of you that has never felt entirely at home in this world. And what is actually there, the Gnostic teachers insisted, is not what the Demiurge's rewrite told you. What is actually there's not guilt, not brokenness, not an emptiness that needs to be filled by obedience to an external authority. What is actually there's the same spark that was present in Adam before the Archons began their long work of burial. A fragment of the original light that no amount of narrative revision has ever been able to fully extinguish. The Gnostic texts themselves were ordered destroyed by the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 of the Common Era, when the assembled representatives of what was becoming Orthodox Christianity decided which texts would form the official canon and which would be labeled as heresy and eliminated. Communities that preserved Gnostic teachings were dispersed, their leaders killed or exiled, their books burned. And yet, the Nag Hammadi text survived because in approximately the year 367 of the Common Era, when the Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria sent out his famous Easter letter ordering the destruction of all non-canonical texts, some unnamed monk or keeper of sacred knowledge in the desert region of Upper Egypt, chose to hide them rather than destroy them. 52 texts were sealed inside a large clay jar and buried at the base of a cliff near the town that today bears the name Nag Hammadi. And there they waited, sealed in the desert, for 16 centuries, until 1945, when a local farmer digging for fertilizer broke open the jar and found inside it a library that would change the understanding of early spiritual history forever. What came out of that jar was not abstract philosophy. It read like testimony, like the preserved voice of a tradition that had been forced underground, still speaking with the urgency of people who knew that what they carried mattered. The text did not claim to offer belief. They offered recognition, a way of naming what the reader had already felt but had never found language for. The sense that this world is not all there is. The sense that something inside you does not belong to the system you were born into. The sense that the story you were told about yourself was always a little too convenient for the people telling it. The first lie was not just theological. It was personal. It was aimed directly at you, at your sense of what you are, at your understanding of what you carry inside you, at your capacity to trust your own direct experience of the sacred without requiring permission from any institution to do so. The Demiurge's rewrite told you that you were broken, that you arrived in this world already in a state of deficit, already owing a debt you did not incur, already in need of salvation from something outside yourself. And because that story was embedded at the very foundation of the civilization most of the modern world inherited, it feels like truth. It feels like the natural order of things. But the Gnostic teachers, those voices preserved in clay for 16 centuries against the possibility of exactly this moment, they said something different. They said that what you feel as emptiness, as longing, as that persistent sense that something about this world is incomplete and that you're somehow more than the role you have been assigned, that is not a sign of brokenness. That is the spark. That is the fragment of pleromaic light that the Demiurge could not remove, could not destroy, could only try to bury under layers of narrative revision. The longing is the memory. The restlessness is the recognition. The part of you that has always felt slightly out of place in a world that demands your obedience, but never your full awakening. That part of you has always known that the first story you were told was not the whole story. The lie was the beginning, but it was never meant to be the end, because you cannot permanently bury light. You can cover it. You can redirect attention away from it. You can construct elaborate systems of belief designed to keep human consciousness focused outward, looking to authorities and institutions and inherited narratives rather than inward toward the direct experience of what has always been present. But the light itself does not diminish. It does not age. It does not surrender to the weight of centuries of burial. It simply waits the way those texts waited in the Egyptian desert for the moment when the conditions shift, when enough people stop accepting the surface version of their own story, when the lie becomes visible enough that the truth beneath it can finally breathe again. You are here. You are listening. That alone means something in you has already begun to question the first story. And that questioning, no matter how quiet, is exactly what the rewrite was designed to prevent. The Archons, according to the ancient teachers, do not respond to those who sleep. They respond to those who begin to remember. The pressure you feel when you try to look inward, the doubt, the distraction, the sudden urgency of 100 small demands pulling your attention back to the surface of things, none of that is accidental. It is the system doing what the system was built to do, keeping the spark buried, keeping the first lie intact. But here is what the Demiurge never understood and could never understand, because understanding it would require an awareness he was by definition incapable of. You cannot rewrite what is written in light. You can cover the text. You can flood the library. You can burn every copy ever made. But the original remains, not in a document, not in a tradition, not in an institution, but in the very awareness that is reading these words right now. The first lie told you that you are small, guilty, dependent, and empty. The truth that was buried beneath it has always said something else entirely. It has always said that what you are, at the level that no narrative can touch, is the same light the Demiurge tried to contain and failed. The same light that waited 16 centuries in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert. The same light that is waiting now, not somewhere above you, not somewhere outside you, but exactly where it has always been. Inside the awareness that was never broken, never lost, and never, despite everything, forgotten. The story of the first lie is not ancient history. It is not a debate for scholars or a curiosity for philosophers. It is the story of every moment you have ever felt that you were more than what you were told you were. Every time that quiet knowing surfaced and something in your life rushed in to cover it again. You were living inside the architecture of the rewrite. But the fact that you can recognize it, the fact that something in you responds to this not as information, but as remembrance, is itself the evidence that the lie did not succeed. The spark was never extinguished. It was only waiting for you to stop believing in the story that said it was not there. If something in what you just heard did not feel like new information, but like something you already knew and had simply forgotten, then you understand exactly why this knowledge was buried and exactly why it matters that it is surfacing again now. There is more. There are deeper layers to what was hidden, more texts, more voices, more pieces of the original story that the rewrite tried to erase. If you're ready to keep going, stay connected, because what comes next will not just explain what was taken from humanity. It will show you precisely where it was hidden and how to find it again within yourself. The door is already open. All that remains is the choice to walk through it.